May 22, 1943. North Atlantic, 240 miles southwest of Iceland. Lieutenant Commander William Drain shoves his TBF Avenger into a steep power dive toward the grey water below. Through the oil-smeared windscreen, the dark shape of U-569 grows larger with every second. Her conning tower crew frantically swings dual 20mm cannons skyward. Tracer rounds arc upward in lazy streaks that accelerate into white-hot bullets screaming past Drain's cockpit. His airspeed indicator climbs past 100 knots. The altimeter unwinds. 600 feet, 400 feet, 200 feet. The Avenger shudders as anti-aircraft shells punch through her wing fabric. In the tunnel position behind him, his radioman trains the camera downward, documenting what conventional wisdom said couldn't be done. Drain pushes the nose over steeper. 20 degrees down. The U-boat fills his gun sight. Her deck gunners are firing straight at him now, close enough to see their panicked faces. At 100 feet above the waves, traveling at nearly 230 miles per hour, he punches the release. 4 Mark 47 depth bombs tumble from the bomb bay. They strike the water in a precise line, straddling U-569's pressure hull just aft of her conning tower. The submarine's stern lifts violently from the sea as the Torpex charges detonate 25 feet below the surface. Drain wrenches the Avenger into a screaming left turn, his vision graying at the edges from the G-forces. Behind him, U-569's bow rises vertically before she slides backward into the depths. What Drain and his squadron mates from Composite Squadron 9 had just proven would fundamentally change how the US Navy hunted German submarines. But it would also demand that American pilots fly straight into withering anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where a single mistake meant certain death. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its crisis point. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than American and British shipyards could replace them. In the first 3 months of 1943 alone, Carl Nitz's submarine fleet sent 108 ships totaling over 600,000 tons to the bottom of the Atlantic. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. If the trend continued, Britain would be starved into submission within months. The problem wasn't a lack of anti-submarine aircraft. The US Navy had deployed its first escort carriers, converted merchant ships topped with flight decks, to the Atlantic in March 1943. Ships like USS Bogue, USS Card, and USS Score carried TBF Avenger torpedo bombers specifically configured for hunting submarines. Each Avenger could haul 4 depth bombs in its cavernous bomb bay and patrol for over 5 hours at ranges exceeding 1,000 miles. But having the right aircraft didn't mean having the right tactics. The standard anti-submarine attack doctrine called for level approaches at altitudes between 300 and 500 feet. Pilots would identify a surface U-boat, make a steady horizontal run, and release their depth charges from a safe altitude. The theory was sound. Stay high enough to avoid enemy flak, maintain stable flight for accurate bomb release, and minimize risk to the crew. In practice, it was proving catastrophically ineffective. German U-boat commanders had learned to exploit the weaknesses of these high-altitude attacks. The time between visual acquisition and weapon release gave submarine crews precious seconds to crush dive. By the time depth charges hit the water, the submarine was already 50 or 60 feet down and diving hard. The standard 10 foot depth setting meant bombs exploded harmlessly above their targets. Worse, the horizontal approach gave U-boat gunners extended opportunities to track incoming aircraft and fill the sky with defensive fire. The statistics backed up the frustration. Through the early months of 1943, escort carrier aircraft made dozens of attacks on surface U-boats with minimal results. Depth charges ricocheted off the water at speeds above 100 knots, skipping over submarines like stones across a pond. At the prescribed altitudes, bomb spacing was too wide to guarantee a kill, even with perfect aim. And every failed attack meant the submarine escaped to continue hunting convoys. Squadron commanders studying after-action reports noted a troubling pattern. Nearly every attack that failed to sink a U-boat shared common characteristics: high approach altitude, level flight path, excessive standoff distance, and slow closure speed. The submarines either submerged before weapons release or absorbed damage that proved non-lethal. What made the situation particularly maddening was that German submarine tactics were evolving. By May 1943, U-boat High Command had begun equipping submarines with enhanced anti-aircraft armament, dual and even quadruple 20mm cannon mounts. Submarines no longer crush-dived immediately when they spotted aircraft. Instead, they remained surfaced and fought back, confident that Allied pilots lacked the nerve to press home attacks through concentrated flak. And they were right. Doctrine explicitly warned pilots against low-altitude approaches. Training emphasized survival over aggression. Attack runs from 400 feet meant relative safety for aircrews, but it also meant U-boats escaped to kill again. For the pilots of Composite Squadron 9 embarked on USS Bogue, the disconnect between training and reality became impossible to ignore. They'd endured the tedious crossing from Norfolk to Iceland. They'd flown dawn-to-dusk patrols in weather that turned cockpits into ice boxes. They'd spotted U-boats and attacked by the book, only to watch their target slip beneath the waves undamaged. Something had to change. The U-boats were winning, and doctrine was failing. What VC-9 needed wasn't safer tactics. They needed tactics that worked, even if those tactics demanded pilots fly into the teeth of enemy fire at altitudes that offered no margin for error. The answer, when it came, would seem obvious in retrospect, but in May 1943, it required a fundamental rethinking of everything the Navy taught about anti-submarine warfare. The U-boat crews had every reason for confidence. They'd survived the killing waters of the North Atlantic through skill, aggression, and iron discipline. Now they were armed with weapons specifically designed to destroy aircraft foolish enough to close within range. Allied airmen lacked the stomach for real combat. One U-boat commander wrote in his patrol log after successfully driving off an attacking bomber. They make their runs from safe altitudes and flee at the first sign of resistance. It wasn't entirely wrong. German gunners were well trained, and their new 20mm mounts could put out over 800 rounds per minute. The geometry of engagement favored the submarine. A level-flying aircraft presented a stable target moving in a predictable path. The pilot couldn't maneuver aggressively without ruining his bomb run. What the Germans couldn't have anticipated was what desperation could produce. Captain Lieutenant Rudolf Bahr, commanding U-569, had already survived 2 years of Atlantic combat when his submarine set out on patrol in May 1943. His boat carried the upgraded anti-aircraft suite, and his crew had practiced anti-aircraft drills until they could man their guns and open fire within 15 seconds of a lookout as warning. Bahr believed his biggest threat came from land-based RAF Coastal Command aircraft operating from Iceland and Newfoundland. Those long-range bombers had been growing more aggressive, but they still attacked from altitude and could be fought off or evaded with crash dives. The small American escort carriers now prowling the Atlantic seemed almost trivial by comparison. Their aircraft were slower than land-based bombers, carried fewer depth charges, and their pilots appeared tentative. The assessment wasn't entirely unfounded. Through April and into early May, U-boat encounters with carrier aircraft had produced minimal German casualties. Most attacks resulted in minor damage at worst. Submarine crews grew accustomed to remaining surfaced when they spotted distant aircraft, confident they could dive if the threat materialized or fight if the plane closed. Meanwhile, frustration mounted in the ready rooms of USS Bogue. Her Composite Squadron had deployed in March with high expectations. They trained extensively in anti-submarine tactics at Naval Air Station Quonset Point. They understood the theoretical kill envelope of the Mark 47 depth bomb, a 30-pound weapon packed with 200 pounds of Torpex explosive, set to detonate at 25 feet depth, with lethal effect against any submarine within 20 feet of the blast. But theory and practice were proving brutally different. On May 21st, Lieutenant Commander Drain had spotted U-231 at twilight and executed a textbook attack. Steady approach, level flight, weapons release at 400 feet. His depth charges exploded close enough to wreck the submarine's bridge and force her back to France for repairs. Close enough to damage, but not to kill. The next day would bring 3 separate U-boat sightings. It was May 22, 1943, and VC-9 was about to discover what worked. But first, they'd have to abandon everything they'd been taught about survival. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below, and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're finding this story as fascinating as I did researching it, hit that subscribe button. These deep dives into world water history take serious work to get right, and your support makes it all possible. The breakthrough came not from tactical planning, but from battlefield adaptation. Lieutenant William Chamberlain was flying an afternoon patrol on May 22nd. Chamberlain pushed his Avenger's throttle forward and dropped toward the wavetops. Below him, U-569 cruised on the surface. Her diesel was driving her at maximum speed to reach an attack position ahead of the convoy. On her conning tower, lookouts scanned the horizon. They never looked up. What happened next would be analyzed and reanalyzed in tactical studies for the remainder of the war. Chamberlain didn't climb to the prescribed attack altitude. He didn't level off at 400 feet. Instead, he stayed low, barely 50 feet above the waves, and accelerated to maximum speed. The Avenger's Wright R260 radial engine screamed as airspeed climbed past 100 knots. U-569's lookout spotted him when he was less than a mile away. Alarm bells clanged throughout the submarine. The bridge crew scrambled to their anti-aircraft positions, but Chamberlain was already pushing into his attack dive. 20 degrees nose down. The submarine filled his windscreen. The dual 20mm guns opened fire. Tracer rounds streamed upward, but Chamberlain's dive angle and speed made tracking nearly impossible for the German gunners. They were trained to engage level-flying aircraft, not targets diving at them at 230 miles per hour from point-blank range. At 100 feet altitude, and still diving, Chamberlain released all for depth bombs. The Mark 47 seconds struck the water in a tight pattern directly over U-569's pressure hull. Before the submarine could submerge, the charges detonated 25 feet below the surface. The four simultaneous explosions created a massive underwater pressure wave that crushed the U-boat's hull like tinfoil. Captain Lieutenant Barr immediately ordered tanks blown and the crew to abandon ship. U-569 broke surface with her stern rising at an unnatural angle. Water poured from ruptured seams along her pressure hull. 30 minutes later, she went down for the final time, taking 9 crewmen with her. 46 survivors were pulled from the water by destroyer escorts. Back on USS Bogue, the intelligence officers and squadron commanders gathered around Chamberlain's debriefing. The pilot was exhausted, still pumped full of adrenaline, but his report was precise. Low altitude approach, high-speed closure, steep dive angle, weapons release at minimum altitude. The technique had worked, but had it been luck, or could it be repeated? The answer came 2 days later. On May 24th, the same tactics claimed another victim. Again, a low-altitude approach that denied the submarine time to dive. Again, a steep attack angle that disrupted enemy gunners' aim. Again, depth bombs released at 100 feet altitude at speeds exceeding 100 knots. The bombs struck the water with their noses slightly down, driving deep before detonating in a lethal pattern that gave submarines no escape. The key insight emerged from studying the mechanics. A level drop from 400 feet meant depth charges hit the water in a long, spread-out pattern as they fell through the air. Spacing between impacts could exceed 100 feet, too wide to guarantee kills against a 250-foot submarine. But a steep diving release from 100 feet compressed the spacing dramatically. The bombs struck almost simultaneously in a 75-foot pattern that ensured at least one, and usually multiple, explosions within lethal range. The dive angle served another critical purpose. It drastically shortened the time U-boat gunners had to track and fire. A level approach at 400 feet gave defenders 30 to 40 seconds to acquire, track, and fire on the incoming aircraft. A diving attack from low altitude compressed the engagement to less than 10 seconds from visual acquisition to weapons release. German gunners accustomed to tracking horizontal targets found themselves unable to depress their weapons fast enough to track the diving Avengers. There were risks, enormous risks. Flying at 100 feet above the ocean left zero margin for error. A stall, a mechanical failure, even a moment's distraction meant certain death. The pilots had to hold their dives until the last possible second, releasing weapons so low that their own aircraft were endangered by the subsequent explosions. And they had to do all this while flying directly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Within weeks, every composite squadron in the Atlantic adopted the new technique. Squadron commanders standardized the approach. Enter from cloud cover when possible. Maintain maximum speed. Push into a 20-degree dive at 600 feet range. Hold steady aim. Release at 100 feet. Immediately execute a hard left brake to avoid flying through the explosion pattern. The TBF Avenger proved ideally suited to the mission. Its rugged construction could absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. The pilot sat high in an armored cockpit with excellent visibility. The bomb bay held exactly 4 Mark 47 depth bombs, set to 25-foot detonation depth with 75-foot spacing. The perfect combination for the compressed diving attack pattern. Fighter escorts flying F-4F Wildcats added another layer of lethality. They'd strafe the submarine's deck 3 to 5 seconds before the Avenger's attack run, forcing German gunners to take cover. The coordination had to be precise. Too early, and the submarine's crew recovered. Too late, and they interfered with the depth bomb attack. It was working. Throughout June and July 1943, escort carrier groups using the aggressive new tactics sank German U-boats at rates that stunned commanders on both sides. The submarines that had terrorized the Atlantic for 3 years were suddenly the prey. The tactical bulletins went out across the U.S. Atlantic Fleet by early June 1943. A discussion of anti-submarine tactics, prepared by VC9 and distributed to every composite squadron, outlined the precise methodology that had proven lethal to U-boats. The document didn't mince words. The type of attack preferred by this squadron is to use cloud cover, sun, or other elements to the maximum for concealment. The attack is made in a long power glide at maximum speed when at considerable distance. However, on approaching the vicinity of the submarine, the speed must be reduced to 180 to 00 knots to reduce the possibility of a ricochet. That detail proved critical. Early attacks at excessive speed had seen depth bombs skip across the water surface like stones, bouncing over submarines and exploding harmlessly beyond them. The solution was counterintuitive. Pilots had to slow down in the final seconds of their dive, even as every instinct screamed to maintain maximum speed for survival. Some pilots even lowered their landing gear momentarily to kill speed, then retracted the wheels to clear the tunnel camera window for photographs. It was an audacious technique that reduced airspeed to 160-170 knots at the moment of weapons release, slow enough to prevent ricochets, but fast enough to complicate enemy fire control. The dive angle specification was precise: 20 degrees nose down. Steeper and pilots risked flying into their own explosions. Shallower and the attack pattern spread too wide. 20 degrees compressed the depth bomb spacing to 75 feet while still allowing pilots to pull out safely above the wave tops. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, saw the potential immediately. He'd been advocating for offensive carrier operations against U-boats since April, but the tactics had finally caught up with the strategy. In a May 27th message to Atlantic Fleet headquarters, King authorized escort carrier groups to cut loose from their convoy escort duties and actively hunt submarines based on intelligence derived from breaking German Enigma codes. The combination of signals intelligence and aggressive attack tactics proved devastating. Allied codebreakers could identify where German U-boat tankers, the Type 14mm cows, were scheduled to rendezvous with attack submarines. Escort carrier groups would race to those coordinates and establish patrol patterns. When submarines surfaced to refuel, Avengers would strike using the new diving attack method. Between May and August 1943, escort carrier aircraft sank 17 U-boats, including 5 of the critical tanker submarines. Each tanker sunk meant a dozen attack submarines forced to return to French bases prematurely, unable to reach their patrol stations off the American coast. The strategic impact multiplied exponentially. German submarine commanders reported the changed circumstances in increasingly desperate radio messages. Allied aircraft now attack with extreme aggression. One patrol report stated, "They dive from low altitude directly through flak. Our defensive fire has minimal effect. Recommend all boats crash dive immediately upon aircraft sighting, regardless of tactical situation." But crash diving offered no guarantee of survival. The compressed attack timeline meant submarines detected at periscope depth were struck before they could reach safe depths. The Mark 47 depth bomb, optimized for 25-foot detonation, proved lethal against submarines attempting to escape downward. The revelation extended beyond pure tactics. The success validated the entire concept of small escort carriers as offensive weapons. These converted merchant ships, derided by some fleet carrier advocates as inadequate for real combat, had proven ideal for anti-submarine warfare. They were numerous, expendable if necessary, and carried enough aircraft to maintain continuous patrols across thousands of square miles of ocean. By the end of 1943, escort carrier groups had sunk 24 German submarines. The tactics pioneered by Composite Squadron 9 in May had become standard doctrine across the U.S. Navy as Atlantic anti-submarine forces. Lieutenant Commander William Drain survived the war and retired from the Navy as a commander. His innovations in anti-submarine tactics earned him the Navy Cross and recognition as one of the pivotal figures in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. The citation accompanying his decoration specifically referenced his aggressive spirit and disregard for personal safety in developing the diving attack methodology. The statistical impact of the new tactics became undeniable by late 1943. German U-boat losses had skyrocketed from 38 submarines in May 1943 to 237 by the end of 1944. Admiral Karl Knitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, Escort carrier groups accounted for 53 confirmed U-boat kills during the war, with another dozen probable or damaged beyond repair, as Admiral Francis Lowe, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Navy's 10th Fleet, noted in an October 1944 memorandum. CVE support groups accounted for about 60% of all U-boats sunk by U.S. forces in the Atlantic and Mediterranean during the 6 months April through September 1944. Individual escort carriers built legendary records. USS Bogue's aircraft sank 13 submarines. USS Card's Composite Squadrons claimed 9. USS Core destroyed 8. USS Guadalcanal's group not only sank 3 U-boats, but captured U-505 intact in June 1944. The only German submarine captured by U.S. forces during the entire war. That submarine, preserved today at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, stands as a monument to the effectiveness of escort carrier operations. The tactical doctrine proved so effective, it was adopted wholesale by the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. British escort carriers operating in the Atlantic, Arctic, and Mediterranean incorporated the aggressive diving attack techniques. The successful British operations against U-boats transiting the Bay of Biscay in late 1943 relied heavily on American-developed tactics. The innovations extended beyond World War II. Post-war anti-submarine warfare doctrine built on the fundamental insights of 1943. Aggressive prosecution of targets, compressed attack timelines, precise weapons delivery from minimum altitudes, integration of multiple aircraft in coordinated strikes. The helicopters that eventually replaced fixed-wing anti-submarine aircraft in the 1950s and 60 seconds employed conceptually similar tactics. Rapid approach, immediate attack, no opportunity for submarine evasion. The human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic put the tactical victories in sobering perspective. Over 30,000 Allied merchant seamen died in the campaign. Germany lost 783 U-boats and approximately 30,000 submariners, a 75% casualty rate that made it the deadliest branch of any military service in World War II. The escort carrier pilots who pioneered the diving attack method accepted casualty rates of 8 to 10% per deployment, extraordinarily high by aviation standards. But the mathematics were undeniable. Before May 1943, U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. After the implementation of aggressive carrier-based anti-submarine tactics, the equation reversed. By 1944, the Atlantic had become a death trap for U-boats, with the average submarine lasting less than 2 patrols before being destroyed. The tactics born from desperation in the spring of 1943 had fundamentally altered the course of the war. Sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to the willingness to challenge doctrine that isn't working. The US Navy entered the Battle of the Atlantic with sensible, cautious tactics designed to minimize risk to its aircrews. Stay high, stay safe, follow the manual. The problem was that sensible tactics were losing the war. What Lieutenant Commander William Drain and his squadron mates discovered was that effective anti-submarine warfare demanded accepting extraordinary risk. Flying at 100 feet above the ocean, diving through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, releasing weapons so close that their own explosions threatened them. These weren't the actions of reckless pilots. They were the calculated decisions of professionals who understood that half measures produced half results. The escort carrier pilots who pioneered these tactics understood something fundamental about combat. The side willing to accept greater risk often controls the engagement. German U-boat commanders had bet that Allied airmen wouldn't press home attacks through defensive fire. They were wrong. In the end, courage and innovation proved more decisive than armor and firepower. The small, slow escort carriers and their aggressive aircrews accomplished what the massive battleships and fleet carriers could not. They broke the back of Germany's submarine campaign and secured the sea lanes that allowed the Allied invasion of Europe to succeed. One spring afternoon in 1943, a frustrated lieutenant commander proved that sometimes the most dangerous tactic is also the most effective. If you found this story as compelling as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and share it with anyone who loves military history. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one soon. What should I cover next? Pacific carrier operations, the air war over Europe, or more Battle of the Atlantic stories? Let me know in the comments below.